Thank you very much for asking me to speak to you today. To deliver the keynote is a great honour. I thank IMarEST, and they were brilliant many years ago making me a fellow, and I look back on those days as the start of something quite special for me in the second phase of a career. And I particularly thank that man over there, Captain, I'm going to call him by his proper name, Captain Stavrakakis. I think he's tremendous. And he's a special man indeed. So thank you for the work that you've done with me in the last couple of days. It's time for the British Health and Safety Executive to exert its full capabilities into our maritime industry. And today, as we near the end of Maritime Safety Week, opened by our Minister of Maritime on Monday at Trinity House, I hope that I may do justice to your earnest wish for our country to become the global leader in global maritime in a safe global industry. If you look around the incredible room at Lloyd's Register in Fenchurch Street, you'll see the reason why London remains the world's maritime centre and why the UK remains a lead maritime nation. If you look at the top of its ceiling, you will see the name of one of our world's greatest physicists, Newton. This is the only interactive bit. Can any of you tell me what Newton's third law is?
Perfect reaction, there's equal opposite reaction.
Well done, sir. And that's our Brexit moment done. Many of us here today view the work of government through the prism of what we hear in the news. And it's no surprise that if we do that, we conclude that EU exit has blocked all other good work. But how many of us here today would know that the government has applied some of the greatest strategic thought that I've seen from any in 25 years? The export strategy from the Department for International Trade, the industrial strategy from BEIS, the environment strategy from DEFRA, and in our own industry, Maritime 2050, a 30-year strategy for the first time in 500 years of being a maritime nation from Department of Transport. If I ask how many of us here in this room have read any of those strategies, or even one of them, how many of us could raise our hands to say that we have? I won't ask for a show of hands. So I offer a simple thought. The words in that room at Lloyd's says the following: they that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters. We do business in ships. We do business in great waters. We in this room contain some of our country's maritime leaders. And we're here in London, in the world's maritime centre. So I suggest you do read Maritime 2050 and respond to the call of our government to play your part as an active public service to help implement it. You've heard this morning from the Health and Safety Executive, and we'll hear more today. Our civil servants are the jewel in our national crown. I wish to thank the HSE for their earnest wish to join in our maritime sector in the spirit of doing great business on great ships in great safety. Do you know what percentage of British companies have a written procedure on confined space entry? Anybody? It's 31%. And do you know how many of those companies have actually implemented it? It's 0%. So what does that tell you as the maritime professional that you are? Is the problem one of regulation or implementation? And if it's the latter, might each of us ask whether now is not the time to exert our own leadership in our own industry? No need to answer me, just a question for your mind. But just ask yourselves, what are the qualities and the characteristics of leadership? It can consist of a wide spectrum, from bravery and courage, which I have seen as a former soldier, though I'm not saying I was any of those things myself, but I did witness them when I was a young Green Jacket officer. It can be subject matter expertise, and the ability to influence those around you, and 100 other things in between. The question is today, whether we are acting as leaders in our industry, and whether government is leading us as the maritime nation that we are. Why are ships still lost at sea? Why is sinking the number one reason for that? And why is fire the number two? And why are hundreds of seafarers and maritime professionals still dying in peacetime? Why are the worst operators in our global industry still employing people in a state of modern slavery on our worst ships? Think in your minds of a definition of a company. There are hundreds. After 25 years in business, I offer to you mine. The definition of a company is the sum of the individuals within it. If you think I lack authority in that definition, then don't, because in November I was made a visiting professor at Durham Business School, so I know my stuff. Think now of the definition of a leader, CEO, an owner in your organisation. Just think for a second. My definition, after all those years, is that my role as the CEO is to create a happy and dynamic environment for those individuals within the company, so as to create a sustainable and profitable one. So have we arrived at the point we have in, how have we arrived at the point that we have in shipping, where the assets that we have in our ships are crewed, in some of them, by some of the cheapest labour on earth, recruited 1,000 miles from the coastline? I used to be a soldier. My regiment, the Green Jackets, is a rifle regiment, and the sister regiment to that are the Gurkhas. Years ago I was attached to them, and I had the privilege of seeing the recruitment of young Gurkha riflemen from the foothills of the Himalayas in Nepal. In those days, some had never seen running water from a tap, or even tied a bootlace. We hold them in this country in the highest regard, and I've long maintained that there are no bad Gurkha soldiers, just bad leaders. Yet in our pursuit of the cheapest labour at sea, Nepalis are now recruited to go to sea, and with many others from other developing nations, being employed in a state of modern slavery on some very, very poorly run ships. Is that not above all a failure of leadership in our industry by some of our peers? That's why our Department for Transport in the UK has made the eradication of modern slavery at sea a national aim. It's in Maritime 2050, and that's why it's worth reading it. And it's worth knowing that we're the first country on earth ever to make that a national aim. And it's why I ask that you read it now, and work out how you can help our government implement it. You have more knowledge, most of you, in your left arm than you know. All I'm asking is that you lend a part of your arm to government for a couple of hours of your time. Just tell the civil servants what you know. They will do the rest. For we are in a new era when the opportunity for us in the private sector to learn to work with those in the public sector in a shared national endeavour that we can all believe in can make our sector a better place, not just for us at home, but overseas too. For what is public service if it's not about the common good, the elevation of the condition of the people, for us at home certainly, but in our role in our industry overseas too? I began in shipping 25 years ago. I'd grown up in port cities in Australia, Canada and Singapore. My father had been in submarines, and he was the basis for my company. But when I began in shipping after the military, I visited your peers. I met some of the finest master mariners and chief engineers in the world, and I have to say some of those far less esteemed too. Those were the ones that were incredibly rude to me. In those days, the world fleet consisted of 40,000 ships, operated by 8,000 ship owners. Over 5 years, I visited nearly 3,000 of them in 20 countries. From Asia to America, from Glasgow to Rotterdam, from Monaco to Genoa. I loved it, and I still do. Many of your predecessors listened to our ideas. Some were engaged, others less so. Some even swore at the very idea itself, that we should be concerned that their ships would not extinguish the fires they had on their vessels or in the cargoes they carried. But fires still happen at sea, and men still die, and ships are still their own fire service when they're at sea. For no one will come in the middle of the Indian Ocean to help, and no one either in the North Atlantic. They can't, at least not in time. So 25 years ago, all we said was this: if your pressurized CO2 discharges or leaks, you will not generate the design concentration for it to extinguish a fire if it does. So why not use technology so that you can? That unit was called Porter Level, and today it's called Porter Level Max Marine. We've won more safety at sea awards because of it than I care to mention. I'm very grateful for that. But why is it not on board every ship? Short of making life rafts, I would suggest that we're the British company who are at the global centre of the #1 reason why ships are being lost at sea, through fire. Today we're in service with 11,000 ships. Nearly 20% of the world fleet are sufficiently concerned that they equip their ships with it. But they're the best operators, those who care, and they're the same ones who lead. The world fleet is now 53,000 ships, So that leaves 42,000 vessels that have no concerns at all about their CO2 systems. The very system that protects their ship and crew and cargo from fire, the number two reason for the ships being lost at sea, and we know that they have insufficient contents to extinguish a fire if it occurs. The regulations are clear that every ship must have the means for the crew to check the contents of the CO2 system. It's clear why. No one ashore can when the ship is at sea. Anything pressurized will leak. CO2 is at 720 pounds per square inch of pressure, which is 40 to 50 bar of pressure, and 300 bar of pressure will come into our industry in the next 3 to 4 years, contained, interestingly enough, in exactly the same spun steel cylinder. So you will step up by a factor of 6 the pressure that you can't monitor today. It will therefore leak, and it will sometimes accidentally discharge. The failure of 42,000 ships in our world fleet not to be so equipped is a failure of leadership, surely. And one of the reasons why every week we read of yet another ship with an uncontrollable fire. So I've travelled to 30 countries for 25 years ever since those first days visiting my first shipping companies. I've been away 4 to 5 months a year. I've got 4 children, and I thank my wife Dorothy for putting up with that. For I spent considerably more time away from home by far in my business career than I did in the military. Morning. Meeting some of the world's former master mariners and chief engineers guided me, assisted me, and I learned a great deal from them. To become who we are today, the world's leading manufacturer of systems to protect ships against sinking, primarily, and against fire, secondarily. As I said, we're now aboard 11,000 ships, the world's top navies, half of the world's offshore oil and gas operators, and one of the 4 offshore renewable manufacturers. It's very interesting to me that in the marine domain, offshore oil and gas, you would barely be able to walk around an offshore oil and gas platform equipped with a multitude of equipment in a way that we casually disregard at sea. Some of you here today are fellows of this institute, and some of you might be fellows of mine at the Royal Institution of Naval Architects. So you really are my fellows of our industry. We're meant to be learned, and we are meant to be our industry's leaders. Anyway, 2 years ago I stopped flying. I thought it's time that I supported government, to use the time I used to spend overseas seeing what I could do in public service. I now support in modest ways 5 departments of state, including the Department for Transport, but also the Ministry of Defence, the Foreign Office, the Department for International Development, and one other, Department for International Trade. And in a very modest way, I supported our 30-year maritime strategy too, Maritime 2050. And 4 of the 5 core values in it apply to us here today with the Health and Safety Executive. The first of these in Maritime 50, the first core value they express in the strategy document, is that the British government is determined that the UK maintains itself in our global industry, quote, as a premium brand uncompromising on safety. It's the reason we're here today. The second core commitment is making a commitment to the international rules-based system. That's predicated on English law. It's the reason that we exist as a country. And the corollary for that is that without a rules-based international order, we simply have chaos. And we know that chaos hurts the weakest. Just as in our industry, I suggest that the degree of chaos exists, but you don't recognize it, and that the people who suffer most are the people at the bottom of our industry. The third core value within Maritime 2050 is that we are global Britain, and therefore look as much to Europe as we do America, the relationship that we have with America, the Commonwealth, and the rest of the world. And the fourth, interestingly, is that we are establishing a government-industry partnership. So may I suggest that you call the maritime team at DFT to see how you can assist your government to implement Maritime 2050. Let's just see for a moment how we can support government. And at the end of this, if any of you need introducing to anybody at DFT, please just drop me a line, and I'll give you my card later. I'll just ask a couple of rhetorical questions, and thank you for your patience. I know I'm putting I'm putting your schedule back, so I apologise. It's Panos' fault.
You've got 6 minutes, you're fine.
All right. Well, I haven't got time for a cup of tea, that's sure. I just want to ask a few rhetorical questions, just for your mind. In our industry, what do you think in your mind? Are we placing environmental emphasis over safety? Have we got the safety piece right, which would then allow us to do the environmental? Why are we not increasing coordination between the IMO and the ILO? And why do those two bodies fight between each other? Why are we not really looking at better training for all seafarers? Most masters do not even understand how to apply optimum trim or optimum speed on a vessel. They too need better training. Should we de-escalate our discussions on autonomy at sea? Should we tackle shipping's attachment to cheapness? Why don't we stop the outsourcing of national flag state responsibilities to the private classification societies? The threat to the UK as a UK flag state is far less from other genuine flag states and much more from the private companies that pretend to act as nations, particularly in Liberia and Panama. The only way to stem the reduction in the UK fleet moving to EU flags on EU exit is surely for the UK flag to lead in maritime safety globally. Women in UK maritime is a good thing, particularly if you note that women's influence in the marine sector generally has far greater impact than men. In my own company, I started out as 95% male, we're now 60% ladies. We're now employing women in their third careers. That's the career by which the children have got to university, finished university, and then on to their careers, and the ladies, particularly for us overseas, have very little prospect. Let's take as an example 3 core issues and examine the synergies they have in their safety outcomes and identify what we can do to resolve them. I've chosen 3. In confined space entries, the regulations state that every ship must have on-board oxygen monitors and flammable and toxic gas monitors. So we know that we've got the kit on board the ship to protect life at sea. We've written the procedures for their use based on the fundamental underlying science and their engineering and technical implications. So why then are mariners losing their lives every year at sea when they enter a confined space and stay there, dead? If the kit is on board and the procedures for their use are written, the only reason they die is because of our industry's failure of leadership on board, whether from the masters and the chief engineers aboard the vessel or from the head office ashore. That is the consequence of poor leadership. In my own field of CO2 contents at sea, a ship depends on its CO2 system to protect against fire at sea. Stored in up to 600, 400, 45 kilogram cylinders, CO2 is stored under high pressure. The master and the chief engineer are trained in its location, what its effect on fire is, how to actuate it, and to conduct a simple visual inspection of it. Yet few of them understand the science behind a CO2 system beyond its pure or its physical characteristics. They understand that it can asphyxiate, yet we still have mariners dying at sea because of just that. We know that it's a liquid gas stored under pressure and that it vaporizes on discharge and expands by volume. We also know that it's incredibly cheap. Because we know these things because we supply the very companies that service the CO2 systems. We know that because in Dubai they report that 20%, that every ship on average is deficient by 20% in the CO2 system that's tested. We know that 80% of the Dubai marine servicing companies issue the certificate for all 600 cylinders, having tested less than 5. So that leaves the ship below the threshold at which a sufficient design concentration can be generated in the event of fire to put it out. Why? Because our worst ship owners don't want the CO2 system maintained. They want the certificate issued by the company to say that it was, for insurance purposes. And in China, we know that 80% of China-flagged vessels are deficient in their CO2 systems. And every year mariners die, ships are lost to fire. I wonder whether if any of us studied the Marine Accident Investigation Branch reports, looked at the MCA, both part of the Department of Transport, and containing some of the best in the world, and how many of their accident reports reference the contents of their CO2 system. All of these combine, not to a lack of regulations, nor to the written procedures, but to a lack of leadership. My third example would be that in the way we crew our vessels, some of our worst operators think that the cheapest crew is best, and some think that they should be worse than that, to allow mariners to exist in the state of modern slavery, verging on poverty, that they do is the very opposite of good command and leadership. Which is why in Maritime 2050 our government is committed to eradicate it in the next 10 to 15 years. I believe we will be the first nation on earth to do that, combining our maritime with our finest naval traditions that abolished slavery in the 19th century, and to eradicate its modern form today. That is an act of leadership by our government. And all of us in this room can play our part to inform, advise and command and assist it. So I ask you, if you have time, a couple of hours a month, to work with government as your core value in the public service of theirs. That is leadership. So you see, there is a connection. In all three cases, your peers had the wherewithal to identify problems and generate the policies that led to the regulations at home in our MCA and globally at the IMO, of which our country is the lead maritime nation. And it's the reason its headquarters are in London, just across from Parliament. We in this room sit on its committees, but the regulations generate the equipment that are the tools to solve the problems. And in turn, the regulations and the equipment generate the working procedures so that both combine to a cohesive whole, to preserve safety of life at sea. It's called SOLAS. And the best of our operators sail in good faith that their mariners will be safe. For when we go on great ships to do great business, we have enough risk to cater for from winds and seas. But our greatest failures lie in our worst practices, and that is about us, and whether we can look the world in the eye and say, we led. Thank you very much to all of you, and I hope very much that the rest of the day goes well for you.